But the Romans didn't like Christians, like really didn't like them. And we forget about this, but they were persecuted. And persecuted didn't mean you were just had your license not renewed at the DMV. Persecuted means you were beheaded. It meant you were killed. It meant you were executed. It meant your arms were cut off if you didn't pledge your allegiance to the emperor. You all know this, right? The emperor in Rome was the emperor god. He was the Prince of Peace, not your Jesus. And if you didn't agree to burn offerings to the emperor, they would cut your arms and legs off or something. They would, or worse. So the threat was real. Christians had to go into hiding, basically. And so they didn't have churches, okay? They were persecuted. So when did it end and how did it end? How did that end? It's, again, right here in your sheet. But who comes along in about 300 AD? Emperor Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. He, by the way, never was a wholehearted Christian, right? He said, we'll just add Christians to the pagan thing. So if you want to be a pagan, that's fine, but we're going to make Christianity the official religion of the empire, and we are going to consecrate churches now for the first time. And so this brings us to our first slide. It's a very interesting one. This building you're looking at was built in 310 AD, which is amazing to me. It's kind of astounding. It's one of the only surviving imperial buildings from Imperial Rome that exists basically unchanged. You have to use your imagination. Church pews only came into use around the 1500s. Before then, there were no pews in churches. There would have been straw on the floor, and people would kind of meander around to hear and see what was going on, right? This also is an interesting building because when it was built in 310, it was actually built as a throne room for the emperor in Trier, Germany. So it was not a church, it was a basilica, or a palace, and it was probably covered in gold. There would be no pews. There would have been an imperial throne here, and that's where the emperor would have conducted his business. The building still stands today as a church, and it looks much like it did back then. So it was converted relatively soon after Christianity was made a religion. So we're going to talk about buildings a little bit. We come to realize that the basic layout of a Christian church, even today, even upstairs here, is based off of a pagan building. The Roman basilica. Okay? The Romans had basilicas before basilicas were churches. Basilica is just the Roman word for meeting place, right? Basilica was a public meeting space where there was a law court. So the basilicas are basically like their courts. A judge would have sat on the throne in the apse. Okay, this is the apse, right? The kind of termination of the sanctuary, or the nave. He would have sat there in a raised platform, surrounded by other authority figures. And so Romans, pagans, would come to a basilica to plead their case, to be tried in court, whatever, and then there was a judge who would rule. You can see what the early Christians did. They replaced the Roman law with the gospel. Right? They put Christ on the throne, or they put Christ's representative on earth, who would have been the bishop, the priest, right? And you see this still in Roman Catholic churches, where the priest is a representative of God, right? Lutherans have a different theology about priests and pastors, right? We don't necessarily believe that. The early Christians probably chose to convert these buildings instead of pagan temples because they were more sort of neutral. They would have been easier for pagans to digest, although they did convert a lot of pagan temples into Christian churches too. So I'm going to show you a couple more pictures here. This is the Trier Palace from the outside. So this is the outside, this is the inside. Like I said, it's one of the only buildings like this that remains, that hasn't fallen into ruin. So this is cool. Part of my talk here is because I went to Rome this summer, and I saw some of these things. So this is an early basilica built by Constantine about the same time. This was called, what was it called? It was just called Constantine's Basilica. And it was originally a pagan basilica that was made into a church. This is what it looked like when it was a pagan basilica. So you can actually see, I wish I had a pointer or something, but you can see these kind of recessed concrete things, and you can see these large arches. Well, those still exist in the ruins today. They're just kind of hard to see. And this is the layout for that room. So here you've got Constantine's, the Colossus, this giant statue of Constantine. It's a little blurry, I realize, but you can see how it would have been fairly simple to replace the pagan statues with statues of saints and stuff, and then you would take this pagan sculpture out and replace it with an empty throne for the bishop or whatever, and then you can put other Christian furniture in there, and there you have it. Then you have a church. And of course, what's fascinating is how churches today still kind of look like this. I learned something in my research that I never really knew before. These pillars you see in lots of churches are stylized people. Did you know that? This is hair. Columns they're either stylized trees or people, so that when you see the kind of scrolling tops, they're basically stylized women. It's supposed to be an elegant, beautiful kind of human form. And that's why in some Greek temples you'll actually see like a human being is the column. Have you seen that before? Where it's like they're going like this or something. And so over time they stylize it to be this more sort of perfect, abstract person. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so how do we get from here to here? This is a picture I took this summer. Isn't that amazing? I took that photograph with my phone. It doesn't even look like it could be a picture, right? These letters up here, those are 6 feet tall. They're 6 feet tall. It gives you a sense of the scale. And this, even in this photograph, the building is doing what it's intended to do. Okay, which is what we're going to talk about. This is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It took inspiration from the ruins of the previous building I showed you. It was inspired by Constantine's work. It is the largest church by volume in the world. It is the largest church in the world, not by footprint, but by just sheer volume. We could fit like 50 Zion sanctuaries in here. I mean, maybe more. It is gigantic. I didn't even realize how big it was. It's impossible to photograph it because it's a cruciform shape. So when you get to this central altar, there's a giant transept over here, and then another giant transept over there. It's like the size of like 2 aircraft carriers. I mean, it is just enormous. So let's talk about this building for a second. It was financed largely with indulgences. This building was being constructed during Martin Luther's life, right? It wasn't completed until the early 1600s. So it actually is completed in the early Baroque era. And you can see some Baroque influence here. For example, this famous iron sculpture with the kind of wavy lines is very Baroque. So that's early 1600s. But they started building it in the early 1500s with the sale of indulgences. Okay, what are indulgences, by the way? As Lutherans, we should know all about this. Yeah, it was basically a scam. Like, it was basically just a scam that the Catholics used to finance their stuff. And they said, pay me for this piece of paper. And the piece of paper just says, it's a magical piece of paper that will do whatever I say it does, right? They said it would make you go to heaven, basically. It's ridiculous. This building was built to inspire, but also to dominate. This building dominates you. It is an imperial projection of Catholic power. I had a complicated experience visiting this building. It is built to be an imperial colonizing Catholic church, also financed by the discovery of the New World, right? The Catholics enriched themselves with gold from South America, literally blood money. They killed the Indians and took all their gold and brought it back to Europe. And there's a church in Spain, I don't know where it is, but the whole ceiling is made with gilded gold from South America. And it just makes my skin crawl because it's just blood money. Blood money. It's like a Holocaust. It's just awful. Anyway, so this is fine. This is part of that experience also. Indulgence is promised, and these are quotes, to make you cleaner than when you were baptized, cleaner than Adam before the fall. And an indulgence has as much power as the cross of Christ. These are things that the men selling indulgences literally said. So they would go around the countryside to poor, illiterate, basically ignorant people, right, peasants, and they would say these things to them. And they would have the raiments and authority of the Roman Catholic Church. So of course they believed it, right? Why wouldn't you trust your church? Why wouldn't you trust, your neighborhood priest who's selling you indulgences? But there were educated people who pushed back courageously, right? And this is why we sing A Mighty Fortress, because Luther was fortifying himself against this, what he perceived to be evil. Right? Luther said, no, this is wrong. You shouldn't be selling indulgences. This is bad theology. Form should follow function. This is kind of a basic principle of architecture and worship. Form follows function. So in our space, basically the form of the church works so that the room can function in a particular way. That is not happening here. This building is not about form following function. This is about form dominating you. This church doesn't function very well. It's really difficult for music. It's really hard to hear anything. There's no plumbing. There's no bathrooms. Of course, this is something to think about, but a lot of older churches like this don't have bathrooms because they didn't have plumbing, right? You ever think about that? There's also no electricity. There's no lights. You think about that? There's not a single light bulb in there. Look how well lit it is. I just took that with my camera. It's not filtered or anything. So these people, these engineers, they knew what they were doing, right? It was fascinating. St. Peter's is not interested in form for function. It's impractical for worship. Its form is to completely overwhelm and dominate you with wealth and magnificence. Every inch of it is covered in gold and sculptures and precious marble. The floor is covered in precious marbles and stones. It's covered with gold all over the ceiling. These letters are 6 feet tall. They're gilded with gold. Michelangelo's Pietà is right to my right. I just turn 90 degrees and there's Michelangelo's Pietà, one of the greatest works of art, in Western civilization. This sculpture by Bernini is super famous. The Reredos altar thing up there is all just overwhelming, fascinating. I felt and still feel a profound conflict in this space. I'll show you another slide. We're in a Lutheran Church, so I can tell you these things. Here's another view, just straight down the nave. Look at all the people in there. So, as a tourist, as one who values beauty, history, and art, and engineering, it's an amazing thing to see. Profoundly beautiful. Fascinating, breathtaking, stunning. It does everything it promises. These pillars that hold up the ceiling are massive. Each one of those pillars is like 20 feet thick. I mean, it's just, how many of you have been there? Some of you have been there. Yeah, many of you. So you kind of know what I'm talking about. As a musician, let me back up. As a Lutheran person of faith, I find it a little bit offensive, reprehensible, and tasteless. Honestly. This does not do what Lutherans think church buildings should do. As a musician, it's simply awful for worship. Because I was there, and I sat in a little choir loft, and I heard the choir, and we're going to go there next summer and sing in it, which will be interesting. There was no provision made for music in this space. They didn't care about that. It was an afterthought. There's no choir loft. There's no place for the organ. There's no central focus for worship. It's acoustically not good for singing. If you had 500 or 1,000 voices concentrated in the middle, maybe it would kind of work. But that's the kind of overwhelming space it is. Interesting. So Protestant churches respond to this. This is where I kind of wanted to go this morning, and this is what I found very interesting, is I'm pretty sure, reasonably sure, that people like Martin Luther, Jon Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli were not happy with this building, right? They didn't like it. This is part of why we had a Reformation, to be honest, is they were using indulgences to finance this building that was projecting a message that they didn't agree with. So, you all know about Jon Calvin, right? Who are the three main reformers? Martin Luther, Jon Calvin, who helped launch the movement that we call Presbyterian, the denomination Presbyterian, and Ulrich Zwingli. Does that name ring a bell? How many of you know about Zwingli? So Zwingli is a little bit more obscure to us, maybe because he has a funny sounding name. I'm serious. But he's equally important. Zwingli launches the kind of radical Reformed Protestant movement that is still around today in like the UCC Church, evangelicals, people that do adult baptism. There's a whole complicated kind of domino effect of where Protestant denominations come from. But Lutherans are a strong branch of the Reformation that never really splintered off from each other, right? We're still Lutherans, and we still call ourselves Lutherans. Presbyterians are more or less Calvinists, but then everybody else, Methodists, all kind of spin back to Zwingli and the more radical Reformed movement. And Pastor Connie could probably add some detail or set me straight on some of this stuff, but more or less that's the idea. And you see this reflected in their buildings. I grew up in a Presbyterian church in Salem, Oregon, that was whitewashed on the inside. There was no color in there. The walls were white, the ceiling was white, the windows were plain glass, the altar was white, everything was white. And I always wondered why. This is why. This is why, because they didn't want you to come inside and worship the building. They didn't want you to feel dominated. They didn't want you to feel a projection of power. They wanted you to worship God, right? And so these reformers, they thought that a church building should not encourage thoughts of idolatry, basically. They didn't want you to worship the music or worship the sculpture or be distracted by anything. And the reformers, of course, disagreed on what that meant, and they still do. We still disagree about it, which is part of the wonderful tapestry of humanity. Churches like Zion have some art, some stained glass, but our music serves worship, as does preaching and sacraments. The space is pleasing, but it is serviceable first. It's here to serve a purpose. It's not here to project kind of power onto you. So we can go through a couple more pictures here. Just for context. Here I am in Rome. So these are pictures of the Pantheon in Rome. This is also one of the most ancient surviving buildings. This was built even earlier than the Trier throne room palace. This is the Pantheon that was built like in 30 BC or something, right? I mean, it's really amazing that it still stands. It still stands because Christians made it into a church. And Pantheon means place of all gods, right? Pantheon, all gods. So it wasn't associated with any single pagan god. It's not like the Temple of Zeus or the Temple of Apollo. Those places were basically all torn down. This is a famous building also architecturally because of the oculus. It had the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world for like almost 2,000 years. There's no steel or rebar in it. And these columns in front, you know, I'd always see pictures of it. They are massive. They are so big. It just blew me away just standing up close to it. You have to remember they had no power tools, no machines, aside from pulleys and ropes. Just stunning. These are just some other pictures of it. I just thought this was amazing. This shows you the old city street level, because all of Rome is, risen over the years. This is just the Colosseum. You can enjoy that. There I am. Look. Yeah, that's pretty good. So here we have, this is in the Roman Forum. This is an old pagan temple that was made into a church way back. And it's still a church today, but it's more or less a museum. But that was a pagan temple. This building fascinated me. This is also in the Roman Forum. I don't remember exactly which church it is, but it was a temple dedicated to an emperor. And you see how there's a door here? You see how there's a door here? Over the centuries, the rubble and fill raised the street level up to this. So they had to build a new door, like in the Middle Ages. So this was the street level for centuries. And then in like the 20th century, they finally excavated the Forum, and they went like 30 feet down. And they uncovered the original door, the original steps, and this was all underground. The other thing that's fascinating to me about this building are these gouges. Those were made by early Christians trying to pull it down. I just thought that was just amazing. The early Christians wanted to do away with pagan filth, right? They wanted to tear all this stuff down, but sometimes you just give up. So they probably put cables around here and had horses, and they were trying to just destroy all the old pagan buildings. And they damaged the columns, couldn't do it, and they said, well, we'll make it a church, I guess. And that's what they did. For real. Just amazing. Some other pictures of the forum. So, that brings us kind of into today. So this is an early building. I think there's a date, 1564. This is a Calvinist church now. 1564, pretty soon after the Reformation started, and before St. Peter's Basilica was finished. So there was already a reaction against it. But this looks more like a church today, doesn't it? Those churches in America, they go back to the 17th century, they don't look too different than this. Simple, wood, the pulpit's right in the center, where everybody could hear, small, practical seating, practical decorations, eloquent, very much not like St. Peter's Basilica. Made of wood, perishable objects. This is another modern Calvinist church building, like a new design. This is a modern building. I guess it got a little washed out, but we've all seen churches like this, right? You can trace this directly back to like St. Peter's Basilica. When you step into a church like this, you feel a sense of otherworldly wonder and holiness, but in a very different way from some of the ornate churches of the Renaissance and Baroque and Middle Ages. This church has something different to say. Oh, and what's this? Oh. So let's talk about this space. It's beautiful, right? It's beautiful, it doesn't oppress you, it doesn't dominate you, but it does speak to you. And so, this is our Lutheran Church, let's talk about it. Why a gabled roof? I'm asking, why? First, no, that's fine, it's practical things are important. It points to heaven. Churches usually have a very high ceiling for two reasons. One, it's good for music. It's good for congregational singing. Really, it helps the sound carry. And there's obviously a symbolic meaning in that it's a portrayal of the heavens. Your prayers go up to heaven. That's why in lots of medieval and Baroque churches, you will see images of heaven painted on the ceiling, like in the Sistine Chapel, right? The ceilings are oftentimes painted or decorated in a way to make it seem like they're weightless and they dissolve into clouds, right, into the heavens. Our space does this in a simplistic way, but it still kind of does that. If you go into a church with a low ceiling, it feels really strange. Even evangelical churches will usually have a very high ceiling because it just makes it feel like a church. There's a raised chancel. Not all churches have this, but most do. This is the chancel. Why is it raised up? Yeah, practical, sight, you can see. Is there any other reason?
There are 3 steps going up to it.
There are 3 steps? Do you think that's symbolic or practical?
Symbolic.
Okay, I actually don't know about that. Maybe it's symbolic. Connie, do you know? They put 3 steps in to be the Holy Trinity. We do like the number 3 in churches. It's a way of elevating the space, make it feel a little bit more holy. But again, we're not Eastern Orthodox. We're not Greek Orthodox. We're not Russian Orthodox. We're not Roman Catholic. We don't want barriers between the altar and where you are. We don't want like a screen. Some churches, this thing would be transparent and the altar would be behind it and you wouldn't see it. Are there any fences or rails or fence-like structures in here? Maybe just the pews. Yeah, there probably used to be. A lot of Lutheran churches, even today, will have some rails for kneeling, right? Kneelers. Or rails for practical purposes so people don't stumble. But basically, there's no obstructions in here. There's no rails or fences because we want you to feel Like you're flowing through the space and you can go anywhere and it's all open to you. It's your space. I mean, this is really a central tenet, I think, of Lutheran theology. And I know Connie would agree, like, it is your church. It is not our church as your staff and pastors. It's yours. You finance it, you live in it, it's yours. We are here just to serve you and to enable your experience. It's a different theology than like a Roman Catholic church, right? Okay, are there any kneelers in our sanctuary? You used to have kneelers. So,
No, not in the tradition, not in the English.
are there any kneelers anywhere else?
No, well, I was thinking about
Yeah. Just asking questions. Is there a lectern, an ambo, or a pulpit? What's a lectern, what's an ambo, and what's a pulpit? Because there's some furniture in here, right? There's some furnishings. What's a pulpit? Okay, here it is. What's a lectern? I'll give you a hint. What's a lectern? That's where I am right now. This is a lectern over here. What's an ambo? An ambo is just an older term for pulpit, or where the scripture would be. So in some Lutheran churches and Protestant churches, you'll see two pieces of furniture. You'll see a lectern, a pulpit and a lectern. Usually the pulpit would be on the right side, and that's for preaching and where you read the gospel. And then the other side of a lectern, a smaller piece of furniture like this, which is traditionally where you read the epistles, right? The other readings aside from the gospel, or you'd like sing the psalms or chant or something. Connie, do you want to add anything to that?
No. I didn't do that.
Yeah, a lot of churches did. I'm not sure what the right and the left. But a lot of Lutheran churches will have two. Modern practices very oftentimes to consolidate them into a single piece of furniture. So here we have a lectern / pulpit. Oh, do we have an altar or a table? It's a table. We call it a table in the Lutheran Church. We don't really call it an altar anymore. You might hear the term altar used kind of casually or colloquially, but we call it a table because we want to emphasize the meal, the shared meal. It doesn't make the sacrament any less holy, but we're not performing a sacrifice up there, right? You perform sacrifices on altars. Our sacrifice is one of prayer, right? And so the pastors preside and make holy the meal at the table where we all partake and we all eat in the agape feast. Is there an eternal flame thing?
Yes.
Yeah, where's that? It's over here. I will just tell you kind of, I'll tell you, I think it's a little silly. I'm sure it was. Well, you can tell me about that. I'm new here, so you can explain to me. There's a little electric eternal flame over there. A lot of churches have things like that. What does that mean and why is it in our sanctuary? Where does it come from historically?
I heard, and I guess could be wrong, but I heard it was because of the JFK grave that has the eternal flame in Christian churches. Thought that was really cool, and then started using it that way.
I've never heard that one before. There is an eternal flame over JFK's burial.
The Holy Spirit is in the eternal flame.
The Holy Spirit is represented by the eternal flame. Doesn't it have a Jewish connection with the eternal flame and the miracle of the lantern that didn't go out, or is that spurious? You know the story of Hanukkah, how the lantern never ran out of oil, it stayed lit? I always wondered if there was a connection to that. I actually don't know. A lot of churches have kept these things more, I think, for tradition. You know, as Lutherans, we shouldn't care that much about it. It's not magical. Like if you unplug it or turn it off, God does not go away. Right? But it provides some comfort, right? And it's a reminder. It's a symbol, basically, right? We look at it as a symbol. I just pointed out, I think it's kind of interesting, and a lot of Lutheran churches I've served at have had those, and I just kind of look at it and think, okay. I don't think Luther ever talked about the light or whatever. It's just kind of come into our sanctuaries.
In remembrance of those who that's what I always thought was important.
Okay, so maybe as a memorial to people, to the saints who've gone before. Well, that's what I mean. Lowercase saints. Yeah. Yeah. It's a memorial piece to remember. So I think that little electric light can basically mean whatever you want it to mean. It's there to serve you and however you enjoy it, I guess. Okay, what is our communion ware made from? The items that we serve communion from. I don't think it's silver. It's probably just plated metal or plated. They're simple objects. They're made of ceramic or they're made of metal. Maybe there's some brass. Maybe they're plated with silver, but they're not made of precious things. They're not made of gold and gems, right? Originally, and in some places in the world, they still use precious metals and stones, gems, semi-precious gems in their communion ware to emphasize the holiness and otherness of the act and the richness of it. As Lutherans, we don't do that. It's, again, sort of practical. I just think that's interesting to point out, that we also don't want to be robbed. I'm serious. You don't want to have precious stuff in your church because people will come and take it. Do we have pews or chairs? Oh, yes, we have both. We have both. Pews are, as I've said, pews are a relatively recent addition to Protestant churches. Lutherans probably had them for most of the time, but for most of Christian history, they didn't have pews. People would come and stand around. Churches were also probably pretty cold in Europe. They didn't have heating, right? They'd have to burn candles is all they had, so it's easier to stay warm. If you can stand your feet, probably. This last question is kind of silly, but I put it in here anyway. What direction does the sanctuary face? Which way does it face? It faces west. Is that significant?
No, it's supposed to face east.
It's supposed to face east. Why is that, Pastor Connie?
Because that's where Christ comes from, the east. The Messiah comes. That's why I'm
So why did they build it the wrong way? Yeah, it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And that's also an important point, that as Lutherans, I'm kind of teasing about the light, the lamp, but a lot of these things don't matter. There's a fancy word I'm going to teach you right now that some of you may have heard called adiaphora. How many have heard the word adiaphora? What does adiaphora mean? It basically means stuff that's not necessary for salvation. It means it doesn't matter in terms of your salvation. As Lutherans, we have a different idea of what adiaphora is than other denominations, right? We think that you should be baptized to be saved, you should have Holy Communion, you should hear the Word, and be an all-around good guy or gal, right? Basically. Things like which direction the sanctuary faces, things like do you have pews or not, do you have a choir or not, do you have a little eternal flame or not, these things are adiaphora. You can dispense with them and it's fine, right? It doesn't affect your salvation. Does that make sense? It's an important idea. Adiaphora does not mean it's not important stuff. It is important stuff. Where the choir sings, what the sanctuary looks like, how the pastors vest, this is all adiaphora. It's important stuff, but it's not necessary for salvation. Okay? So, conclusion. We are Protestant Lutherans, and we represent one splinter of the former Roman Catholic Church. We are actually the very first splinter of Protestantism. All other branches followed after Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, the Anabaptists, etc. So, we've got a couple minutes for discussion and questions. Yes?
We went to a church in Minot, North Dakota for years. Big church, silver chalice. We're not out.
Oh, yes. There is a good story from the early Christian church about Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose was the guy who baptized St. Augustine, and he died around 320 AD. He was a cool guy. He was Bishop of Milan, and some of their prominent church members were kidnapped by bandits, and they demanded a ransom. This is a true story. And Ambrose sold all the church jewels for their chalices and stuff so they could ransom the kidnapped family. And he took a lot of heat for it, and he said, this is what Jesus wants us to do. We want to give our riches to the poor. We don't need this stuff, and these lives are more important. So this has been a debate for a while, actually. But yeah, we have lots of simple objects. Other questions about like church architecture and how it relates to our world today?
So I know that, so I grew up in the LCMS, and like a lot of really Gothic architecture still persisted from the Reformation to now. And the ELCA is like, kind of a break off too, came about mid 20th century. So a lot of the mid-century architecture in a lot of ELCA churches. Newer other churches still do that too and more modern, but do you have anything like, do you know anything about the difference? I know I've always heard of like a Vatican II thing kind of affected all churches, even though it's a Catholic forum, that it kind of affected everyone and like they kind of toned down the Gothic architecture after that. The new construction.
So what's your question?
My question is the gap between Luther and now. Like, why are there still ornate churches in the Lutheran Church?
Well, the Christian church, no matter the denomination, is an inherently conservative organization, right? Churches are always the very last institutions to change. And this is true with like music. Music is what I know mostly about. But, musical developments always happen in the church last, because churches are conservative. And so as the Reformation happened, and continues to happen, church architecture changed, but there are still kind of universal ideas about what a church looks like. The high ceiling, the long nave, right? The raised chancel, the place. We don't have thrones or chairs for the pastors up here, you'll notice. A lot of Lutheran churches still do. You'll have like higher seats for the worship leaders to be elevated from you a little bit. Our awesome pastors just sit with you, right? Isn't that cool? But to answer your question, you still see Gothic construction or Neo-Gothic construction because it's just basically what people like. If the Zion congregation got together and said we want to build a new sanctuary and we want it to be a Gothic style building with a Lutheran twist, you can do that, People like it. And it's a tradition. It's kind of cool to have a church that looks like something that looked like it did 1,000 years ago. Other questions or comments?
I gotta go, but thank you, John.
Thanks, Danny.
Keep asking the questions.
I feel kind of bad now about the lamp. I didn't want to make too light of it. What else? Anybody? Well, we can leave it there. Thanks for coming today. Oh, Eldry has a question.
I think the church keeps on evolving because where the baptismal font has been moving around, and in some churches they put it at the entrance of the church, and sometimes they read the gospel in the middle of the sanctuary, so that it's part of it just keeps evolving.
What's really, and this is maybe the best note to go out on, is that the church, you are the church. You are the body of Christ. The church is not a building. The church is you, right? And the building is just basically a reflection of you, of us together. And so yes, the church buildings continue to develop and change, and I'm not sure evolve is the right word, because that implies that people before us were less evolved. But definitely there's like a development and a change. And, churches in 100 years or in 1,000 years will probably look very different. But there might be common threads that unite us all, right? Some basic principles about what we need in a worship space. It's an exciting topic. I think it's actually very interesting. And it's very beautiful to think about how the buildings and us kind of work together to provide a great worship experience, right? That's the functional part. All right, everybody go have a great Sunday.